Welcome back. Hopefully you've built some intuition around generative models and latent variable models. Before we look at a deep learning-based generative latent variable model, I want us to focus on a deep learning model that gives us the ability to learn good latent representations, but doesn't have a generative interpretation, and that's the autoencoder. We'll then go from the autoencoder to a generative model known as the variational autoencoder. But let's start with autoencoders here. So to motivate autoencoders, let's return to PCA. So PCA is often used for dimensionality reduction, where the goal is to describe our data X with a lower dimensional representation Z. One limitation is that PCA can only model linear relationships. We can see this based on the way the latent variables are mapped to the data. We have a matrix multiplication, W times Z, plus an offset vector, mu. To visually see this limitation, take a look at this example of 2D data. Now with PCA, if we were to try to reduce the dimensionality to a 1D representation, we're limited to a line within this 2D space. And we can see for these data, a better 1D representation could be created by putting down a curve to follow the main density of the data. Additionally, PCA is limited in the way it evaluates error. PCA is minimizing the squared error between X and the reconstruction of X from the latent space. So W, our mapping from the latent space to X, is found by minimizing this error. Now, this least squared error works fairly well for many problems, but not all problems. To motivate that, let's take a look at these three example images. We have two head shapes, either on a white background or on a random noise background. Now, with the least squared error minimization, the images with the white background would be found to be more similar to each other than the images with the same head shape. Now, depending on the goal of our generative modeling, we may want to focus on the major shapes in the image. And PCA doesn't give us a straightforward strategy for doing this. Whereas with deep learning methods, we can redesign that objective function. So to get these access to these nonlinear relationships, to modify our definition of error, as well as to bring in structure, as you saw on a previous day, bringing in convolutional and recurrent structure can make a lot of sense for many problems. So by bringing in deep learning tools, we can gain access to all of these design possibilities and move beyond PCA. And the way we can do this is with autoencoders. The basic structure of an autoencoder is pretty simple. It has two major sections. It has an encoder section that's composed of one or more layers that encode our original data X to our lower dimensional representation Z, oftentimes referred to as a bottleneck in the network, because you can see that the network gets thinner in the middle. And then we have a complementary set of decoder layers, one or more decoder layers, that project back from Z an estimate of X, oftentimes referred to as X prime. We can design an objective function that relates X and X prime, as well as maybe put some restrictions on Z. This is all designable using deep learning tools. And so we aren't limited to just minimizing the squared error as we were in PCA. Although minimizing squared error is a pretty common choice depending on the problem you're trying to solve. So what we have here within autoencoder is a more general mapping from our latent space Z to our data X. And ultimately, we want to control that function F. And the way we get access to a more general version of F is by the addition of nonlinearities. So here I'm showing equations for a very simple single layer autoencoder. And what we see is that there is a linear mapping, right? We have our matrix times x on the encoder side plus an offset. But for both the encoder and the decoder, we also have a function for which that linear mapping is an input. And we can choose this function to allow for more complex mappings from z to x. Now, this is a single layer example. We can have multiple linear and nonlinear encoding and decoding layers. And by adding additional layers, we can allow for increasingly complex versions of f and the inverse of f. Now, what do these autoencoders enable? Here's an example of representation and reconstruction of the fashion MNIST dataset. This is a dataset of images of clothing from 10 different classes. Here I'm showing you the original images in the top row, and the bottom two rows are showing reconstructions from two different latent spaces. One latent space is based on an autoencoder, so we're reconstructing from a 2D latent space with that autoencoder. And the second, the bottom row, is uses PCA. We can clearly see that the autoencoder representation provides a much more faithful reconstruction of the original images. And here, the latent space has the same dimensionality. The major difference is the nonlinearity that's part of the model. Now, autoencoders, it turns out, have a very specific relationship to PCA. And we can actually think of PCA as a special case of an autoencoder. Namely, it's an autoencoder with linear mappings, so there's no nonlinearity. And obviously, we're restricting the objective function to minimize that least squared error. If we apply these two limitations and we train our autoencoder well, we'll have a solution that's equivalent to PCA. Now, if you're interested in understanding that equivalence, stick around for the rest of this lecture. Otherwise, you can move on to the tutorial. So by equivalence, I mean that the two solutions will span the same linear subspace. To provide some intuition, imagine we have a 3D data set. So here are the data points. And you can see that these data points, most of their variation lives on a single plane. Now, if we apply PCA, we're going to fit a covariance ellipsoid. And the two largest axes of that ellipsoid will form a plane. Now, if we take our linear autoencoder with least squares objective function and we fit it to the same data points, it turns out that the projection vectors will live on the same plane as our PCA solution. And so this is what I mean by equivalence. Why are they equivalent? Because both PCA and this linear autoencoder can only perfectly represent data that lives on this plane. Any variation that lives off of this plane will not be represented by either model. So they have equivalent representational power.